Welcome back to the Edgewater Avenue YouTube channel. In today's video, we are making the Dawn top. The Dawn top is a pattern that comes with 5 different options for the front and 3 different options for the back. You don't need any fancy materials for this, just swimwear fabric as well as 1/4 inch swimwear elastic. I also like to use 3/8 inch elastic for the straps since they're just slightly wider and it adds just a little more support. But that is optional and you can definitely do 1/4 inch straps instead. Both sizes of elastic are available under the sewing supply section of my website. A couple notes on the pattern before we get started. Like I mentioned, there are 5 different fronts and 3 different backs to choose from. You can choose any front to go with any back, but what you can't do is use 2 different fronts, even though this top is reversible. So for instance, you couldn't do the standard front with the darted front and then be able to wear it reversible depending on how you feel. Each version of the pattern is individually drafted, so there are just slight differences and it's not guaranteed to fit. Second, the directions for whichever front style you choose are going to be different just at the beginning, and then at the end of the tutorial, it's all going to be the same no matter what style you choose. So I'm going to show you how to assemble all 5 versions of the front, but I'm actually only going to complete 3 different tops in this tutorial. So throughout this video, even if you're making a different style of the front, the directions are the same, it just might look a little different. And the 3 back options also have very similar directions, not quite exactly the same, kind of, it just looks different enough that I am going to show all 3 versions of the back in this. The next note is to pay attention to the size chart. Even though a couple versions of this pattern have there's a darted version, there's a couple split cup versions where there's seams, and that usually adds more cut volume. And I did add more cut volume. However, my patterns are still drafted for a C cup. So if you are bigger than a C cup, I highly recommend adding more cut volume by doing a full bust adjustment. My bust is larger than a C cup, and so at the end of this video, when I show the try-on clips, you'll notice that the top is fitting small on me. So just be aware of that. It's meant for a C cup. If you're larger than a C cup, definitely make adjustments to make it most comfortable. Or you don't have to make adjustments if you just like a more tight fit. And the last note is that seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters unless otherwise stated. I always forget to say it throughout the tutorial, so let it be known now. That should cover it, so let's get started assembling the front pieces. You're going to hear me repeat myself a lot during this, so here are the timestamps with each version. Go ahead and skip to the version you're making to avoid hearing me say the same thing over and over again. Starting with a standard front, you're going to cut 2 total in your swimwear fabric. And here I decided to cut 1 in each of my fabrics for a reversible look. The only notch on this pattern piece is for where the shoulder straps will be, and I suggest waiting to transfer this notch until later. So hang on to that pattern piece. There is nothing else we need to do with this piece, so we can move on. For the darted front, you're going to cut 2 total in your swimwear fabric, and here I decided to cut 1 in each of my fabrics to make it reversible style. Notice that right now I am not cutting out the dart. Once your pieces are cut, we can work on the darts. First, take your pattern piece and cut out the dart. Then, place the pattern piece onto the wrong side of the fabric. Using a sewing marker or chalk, trace the dart legs directly onto the wrong side of the fabric. Sometimes it's helpful to also draw a line down the center of the dart, as this will help you fold it later. Repeat this with both sides and on both pieces. Then, fold the dart so the dart legs are lined up, and sew down all 4 darts using a straight stitch. Stitch directly onto the traced dart leg. Seam allowance is already taken into account. During pattern testing, these darts did not turn out pointy, but if you do come across issues with that, then one tip is starting sewing at the outer edge like I am here, and sewing the dart leg until you reach the tip. And then, instead of backstitching, pull out some thread, clip it, and then tie it in a knot. Again, I didn't find this necessary, but it's totally up to you. After you've sewn the dart, you can trim the excess fabric. And the only notch on this pattern piece is for where the shoulder straps will be, and I suggest waiting to transfer this notch until later, so make sure to hang on to that pattern piece. Next, we will cut and assemble the vertical seam front. Pay close attention to the cutting information on the pattern pieces because the center piece is cut on the fold, but the side piece is to be cut mirrored. So cut 2 in your center piece and cut 4 mirrored in your side piece. Mirrored means that you will flip the pattern piece to account for both the left and right sides. Or you can do what I'm doing here and just fold the fabric, so I'm cutting 2 at once, and this will also mirror the pieces. Each piece has notches, and if you'd like to use the notches for the vertical seams, you can transfer those onto each piece. There's also a notch for where the shoulder straps will be, and I suggest waiting to transfer this notch until later, so make sure to hang on to that pattern piece. Now you should have all of these pieces, and we are now going to sew the vertical seams. Flip the side pieces onto the center pieces with right sides together and pin. Do this with both pieces. Using an overlock stitch, zigzag, or any stretch stitch of your choice, sew each vertical seam. Next up is the horizontal seam front. Your pattern comes with these pattern pieces on the fold, but here I have the full pieces assembled, so just ignore the fact that mine look different and make sure to follow the instructions on the pattern piece to cut on the fold. And side note, if you hate cutting on the fold, you can print the pattern out twice and then flip it and tape it together so that you can have the full piece. Now with these, you're going to cut 2 in each pattern piece. Each pattern piece has notches where they will be attached to each other, so you can transfer those notches now if you plan to use them. There is also a notch for where the shoulder straps will be, and I suggest waiting to transfer this notch until later, so make sure to hang on to that pattern piece. Now flip the top piece onto the bottom with right sides together. And you can pin if you'd like, but you may end up having to stretch a little while sewing, so you might not use pins. I actually took all of these out before I started sewing. And for sewing this, I actually recommend starting at the center and moving out, and then repeating it with the other side. This seam can be pretty tricky, so I also recommend using a basting stitch first. A basting stitch is a long straight stitch that's meant to be temporary. Its job is just to tack this seam down to make sure you like how it's laying. So start at the center and sew to the outside. Then you can go to the other outside edge and sew into the center. The very center of the top piece may get a little bit cut off, and that is totally fine. The finished look is not going to have such a sharp corner anyways. If you like how everything is laying and how the shape is turning out, then you can sew your final stitch, which is going to be an overlock, zigzag, or stretch stitch of your choice. And now last, we will cut and assemble our split cup. These pattern pieces have a bunch of notches, so first let me explain what each one is. The center fold is over on this side, so these 2 pieces you will cut on the fold. Then there is a notch to join the bottom pieces. And the top piece has a semicircle notch, which will match up to the seam where the bottom pieces are joined. There's also this notch where the shoulder straps will be, and I suggest waiting to transfer this notch until later, so make sure to hang on to that pattern piece. And now for cutting, you're going to follow the instructions on each of the pattern pieces, but basically you're going to be cutting 2 in each pattern piece. Remember, there are 2 pieces that you need to cut on the fold, and then the bottom side piece needs to be cut mirrored. Mirrored means that you will flip the pattern piece to account for both the left and right sides, or you can just fold the fabric to cut 2 at once, and this will also mirror the pieces. Now we have all of our pieces. Don't forget to transfer your notches if you plan to use them. And we're first going to assemble the bottom pieces, then we'll sew the top. So place the bottom side pieces onto the bottom center, right sides together. Pin if needed. You'll actually want to sew these seams first, but here I'm showing you what the top will look like when it's flipped down as well. So when you flip down the top, it'll also be right sides together. But first, sew the bottom pieces using an overlock, zigzag, or stretch stitch of your choice. Double check first before you attach the top to make sure your bottom piece is facing the correct way. You can use the pattern piece to make sure of this. Then for the top, we're going to start sewing from the center to the outside edge and then repeat with the other side. Sewing from the center with this style just makes things lay a lot better. And I actually also recommend that you do a basting stitch before sewing your final stitch. I didn't do that with this one and I ended up messing up. A basting stitch is a long straight stitch that's meant to be temporary, and it will help you make sure that things are looking good before sewing your final stitch. So sew the top down, and don't forget to repeat these steps with both your lining and your outer pieces. The front pieces are all made up, and now we are going to cut and assemble our back pieces. There are 3 different backs to choose from, so just remember you need to only choose one style. Each pattern piece has that same triangle notch to show where the shoulder straps will be inserted. And again, I recommend you wait until a bit later to transfer those notches. Remember to follow the instructions on the individual pattern piece for whichever back you're making. For the standard back, you will cut 2 pieces on the fold. Here I'm cutting 1 in each fabric. Match each back piece with right sides together, and you are going to sew and attach 1/4 inch elastic to the top and bottom lines. And more information on the elastic application is coming. I'm just going to get through the other 2 back options. Here is the hardware back, and I'm going to cut 4 pieces mirrored. If you missed it when I explained what mirrored meant, it means that you will flip the pattern piece to account for both the left and right sides. Or you can just fold the fabric and cut 2 at once, and this will also mirror the pieces. Match each piece with right sides together and make sure you have a left and right side. Then sew along the following areas. We are also going to attach our 1/4 inch elastic at the same time, except we are not going to be attaching the elastic towards the edge where the hardware will be. And finally, for the tie back, you will cut 4 pieces mirrored again. Match each piece with right sides together and make sure you have a left and right side. Then sew and attach elastic to the following areas. Now, before going in with elastic, I always recommend sewing these seams with a basting stitch first. A basting stitch is a long straight stitch that is meant to be temporary, and this is going to help you tack down your fabric so that when you go to do elastic in your final seam, it'll just make things sit so much better. For sewing the elastic on these pieces, you want to make sure you're not stretching the elastic. It should sew on nice and evenly. And you can use either an overlock, zigzag, or stretch stitch of your choice for this. And if it's available to you, you can use an elastic foot to help guide the elastic in place. But if you don't have one, you can use your hands to help guide the elastic in. For the hardware back, you're going to want to stop the elastic about 1 inch before reaching the inside edge, and this is how that is done. For the tie back, it can be tricky sewing along the curve at the very end. So here is how that is done. Now we need to make our shoulder straps. So first you need to decide if you're going to make straps with 1/4 inch elastic or 3/8 inch elastic. You can find the respective strap measurements for each of those inside the written directions. I also recommend making your straps longer than what's recommended right now, so that way you can adjust later on if needed. Then fold each strap in half lengthwise with right sides together. Sew and attach whichever size of elastic you're using to the raw edges, again with an overlock, zigzag, or stretch stitch of your choice. And again, you do not want to stretch the elastic. So now we're going to be sewing together our front pieces. So here's the point in the video where the directions are the same for all the front pieces. It just looks a little different depending on what version you've made. Match your front pieces with right sides together and sew and attach 1/4 inch elastic onto the top and bottom lines. As usual, I recommend sewing these seams with a basting stitch first, and then you can sew your final stitch with an overlock, zigzag, or stretch stitch of your choice. Again, you do not want to stretch the elastic. And one other important note is to try to make sure your seams are sewn down the same way so that there's no twisting. Here I have black and white fabrics, so I'm sewing my excess seam onto the black fabric so it doesn't show through. Everything is sewn and has elastic, and now we're going to be sewing our shoulder straps in. So first, get your paper pattern pieces out and find the shoulder strap notches I mentioned earlier. On each of your pieces, mark where the shoulder straps will go. Then, using a seam ripper, rip a hole just big enough to fit the straps through. Do this for your back pieces as well as for your front piece. Then get your straps out. Using a loop turner or safety pin, turn each strap all the way to the right side. Now get out whichever back you're making. With the back still inside out, you're going to insert each shoulder strap inside of each strap opening. You will do this from the inside of each piece. This way, right sides are together and you'll have a clean finish on the outside. So after inserting each shoulder strap, you're going to sew them down with a straight stitch. It also doesn't hurt to go back over this area with an overlock or zigzag stitch, just to be extra sure that the surrounding threads are secured. Here I'm showing all 3 back versions, but the directions are the same for all of them, it just looks a little different. Now that the straps are in, we're going to flip our back pieces to the right side. Then, using a basting stitch, sew down the open side seams. This is going to make it much easier to sew in the next step. Do this with any of the back versions that you're making. So now we will attach the front and back, and at the same time sew in the straps. I'm going to show you this 3 times so you can see how it works with each back version. Here is the hardware back, and first I'm going to show you where things will be lining up before we end up doing this from the inside. Place each back piece so that once inserted, right sides will be together. Work one side at a time with this. First, untwist the shoulder strap and then insert the shoulder strap inside of the appropriate strap opening. Pin in place. Then, insert the back piece inside, aligning the side seam. Pin as needed. Repeat this with the other side too. And here is what that looks like with the standard back. And here's what it looks like with the tie back. All the same steps, just look slightly different. Now we're going to go to sew. Remember, at this point, your right sides should be together. Using a straight stitch or a stress stitch, sew down the shoulder straps and the side seams. Again, you may choose to reinforce the surrounding threads around the strap opening with an overlock or a zigzag stitch. Once you're done, take some scissors and trim any excess. Now we just need to take the top to the right side. To do this, seam rip a 1 to 2 inch hole somewhere along an existing seam. Through this hole, take the entire top to the right side. Then, finish off the hole by stretching it and tucking in the raw edges, and you can do a straight stitch right on top, or you can do an invisible stitch by hand. For all versions except the hardware back, that completes the top, but if you're making the hardware back, we just have to insert our clasp. So unclip the clasp and fish it through the opening, overlapping it by about 3/4 of an inch. Pin in place. Then you will sew this fold down using a straight stitch. Since we're dealing with this hardware, it can be tricky to get super close, so you can use a zipper foot for this if it helps. I also like to do one pass with a basting stitch to tack it into place, and then I'll shorten my stitch length and do my final stitch. I personally found that with the zipper foot, I had to lift my presser foot a lot in order to prevent the fabric from getting caught, so I'm not sure if I'm going to keep using this foot versus my regular presser foot. Trim the excess thread, and that completes the Dawn top. We are done with 3 versions of the Dawn top. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to see some more examples of the other options in this pattern, then you can visit the website, which will have many photos from pattern testers and customers. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.